Hey everybody, it's Jen with True Crime and Headlines with Jules and Jen, and welcome to Season 2. I know you all have been patiently waiting for the season to launch, and I'm so excited to get it kicked off for you all. I'll be taking over the first couple of episodes of True Crime and Headlines Season 2, while my lovely co-host Jules diligently works on preparing her investigative podcast, Missing in Hushtown, for launch. Make sure you save the date because Missing in Hushtown launches on August 16th, available wherever you get your podcasts. If you're following us on social media, I'm sure you've seen a ton of exciting announcements. And if you haven't, then make sure you go follow us. I'll make sure I leave all of our handles in the show notes below. So with the launch of Season 2, I want to share some exciting news. Jules and I have officially teamed up yet again to create a brand new media production company. And you all, True Crime and Headlines is now officially under Fire Eyes Media. Our goal is to share stories that ignite, engage, and inspire. So make sure to stay tuned. We have some incredible projects in the works, and we can't wait to share them with you all. And if you're interested in following along on that journey, make sure you follow us on Instagram. Our handle is Fire Eyes Media. That's FIREEYES Media. But before we get into today's episode, I just want to take a moment, one, to thank you for tuning in and listening and loving True Crime and Headlines. And thank you so much for welcoming me as your new co-host with open arms. And if you wouldn't mind, if you're loving True Crime and Headlines, please take a minute to give us a 5-star review. It means so much to Jules and I. It really helps us in the algorithm, gets us out there, and it allows other people to find us who would like our content as well. But without further ado, let's dive in to today's episode. If you haven't already listened to the first episode in Season 2, I cover the case of Mica Miller. And that case is one we're discussing more in depth today with a very special guest. I'm excited to officially welcome Dr. Joni Johnston. Joni is a forensic psychologist, private investigator, and author of several books, including Serial Killers, 101 Questions True Crime Fans Ask. Joni and I discuss the Mica Miller case and analyze and dissect the behaviors of John Paul Miller and the events leading up to Mica's tragic death through the lens of a forensic psychologist. So I officially want to welcome Joni Johnston to the podcast. Let's go. Thank you so much, Joni, for joining me on today's episode of True Crime and Headlines. So we are going to be discussing the Mica Miller case. And for those that haven't already listened to episode 1 for season 2, I dive really deep into the Mica Miller case and we discuss all of the timeline and all the specifics. But today, Joni is joining me and she's going to be high level talking about her opinions. Now, this is just speculation. This is just opinions. But as a professional in the field, we're going to be talking more of the psychological standpoint as far as John Paul Miller goes and Mica and how tragic this case is just in general, because it's just so sad because of what the circumstances were and everything leading up to Mica's death. So, Joni, I'm going to hand the floor over to you and let you kind of dive in, kind of give us your feedback and your take on this case.
This case is so complicated in some respects. And then on the other hand, I feel like I've read different versions of this case over and over again. We were talking about toxic relationships and coercive control and those kinds of things. So I had really mixed feelings when I saw it. I mean, it is an incredibly tragic case all the way around. And it suggests kind of things being passed down from generation to generation, potentially, at least in terms of J.P. Miller and his father and those kinds of things. But I think what really strikes me is just how their relationship began between Mica and JP. I mean, the age difference, but not just the age difference, the difference in the authority position that they were in, and also the context. I mean, I think one of the most terrible forms of abuse is spiritual abuse because it's so confusing. For many, many people, our spirituality, our faith is something that gets us through difficult times, something we rely on. We feel like it's very, very solid. Our community is a source of comfort, a strength, trust. And when that is not there, I think it can do damage in ways that maybe other forms of abuse don't. And so I think all those things really did stand out to me as how painful and how confusing it must have been for a 14-year-old who comes and joins a church and meets, our youth pastor and, really likes him, and just to see that relationship develop over time.
I love that you make that statement, Joni, because I think that that's really important and maybe something that not everyone's looking at in terms of like the abuse factor of spiritual abuse. It's something that's unfortunately very common nowadays, especially within the church. I've seen it a lot, but the fact that that was used against someone who was so young, like Mica, and you can see the signs of grooming. You can see if you look at this case and you look at the timeline, that Mica was very much groomed. But you're absolutely right. That factor of spiritual abuse is in there because it was used as a manipulation tactic to Mica when it comes to John Paul Miller. And so it's pretty obvious if you look at the details of the case, if you look at the timeline. And that's one thing that I mention in the first episode when I cover Mica's case is the fact that she did meet John Paul Miller so young at 14, and then eventually, got married to him when she was of age. But I will make that statement so no one thinks that she was married, underage. But that whole process, that grooming, happened over a course of many years and ultimately resulted in a relationship, a very toxic relationship.
And I think your point is so well taken, Jen, in that certainly the law defines certain ages as consent versus non-consent. We have to have it that way. Right? There has to be some law and some dividing line that says, okay, you can vote when you're 18, you can drink alcohol when you're 21, you can drive a car when you're 16, or in this kind of things. We have to have these kind of arbitrary ages. But I think when you look at the history sometimes between individuals, it does show that there are so many more factors that go into consent in addition to age. So when you have somebody who meets somebody when they're that young and they're in a relationship, and not a sexual relationship or romantic relationship for many years, but just in an intimate relationship in terms of this is a person's in a position of trust in addition to authority, and that kind of grooming starts taking place at a pretty young age, it's so hard to go, okay, what is consent really? Certainly legally, yes, absolutely. The consent was there. But what does that even mean in terms of somebody understanding the dynamics and manipulation and those kinds of things?
As far as what that does mentally to someone who's that young and goes through that process, that grooming process from 14 to an adult, just what's your take on like mentally what that can do to an individual? It must be, in my opinion, easier to manipulate by that individual because they've been groomed for so many years. But what is your take on that when someone that young is being groomed and then ends up marrying that individual and is in a toxic relationship?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, it certainly sets the stage for a different power structure in that relationship. And I think it becomes very difficult to ever be on an equal basis when you start that kind of relationship. And again, not just in terms of the age difference, but in terms of the authority difference. I think the other part of it that's so significant is that it would certainly, I think, shape how Mica saw the world and saw relationships and saw what was acceptable and what was not. What was her responsibility as a wife, in the spiritual context and the religious context? Because it's not just that she's meeting somebody who starts manipulating her or grooming her. It's that she's involved in an entire community who is supporting the pastor and, admires him, supports him. And so there's all these messages, not just from JP that I'm a great person, I'm a nice person, I'm a religious person, I'm a spiritual person, I'm a leader, etc. But she's getting that feedback from everywhere in her church community. And so I think it would be very difficult to question that as a 14-year-old, as a 15-year-old, and even as a 23-year-old.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think, too, another factor that we need to make sure we're incorporating here is that Mica, whether it was from the years of grooming and potential abuse maybe we don't know about, we don't really know all of Mica's background prior to her being 14 and her history with John Paul Miller. But
she was diagnosed, and we know this because it's documented. We know that she was seeing a therapist and that she was on medication, that she was diagnosed with mental health issues. On top of that, plus dealing with everything she was dealing with while she was married to John Paul Miller, because again, this is all alleged, and he's denying any claims. At least from what I've read, he's denying all of these claims, although a lot of these things are documented, things that he's done to Mica, everything from putting tracking devices on her vehicle, again, allegedly following her, manipulating her, all while she was in the process of trying to get a divorce. So on top of that, you have all of those things to consider, but then she's already suffering from mental health issues. What is your take on that as well? I mean, I believe that obviously it was enough to put her over the edge to make the decision that she did to end her life. And I know there's a lot of speculation on that. I know her family believes that there was foul play involved, but unfortunately, there's no proof of that. Everything, as far as the autopsy, there was no drugs, alcohol, nothing in her system. At least that's what the toxicology report shows. And it was determined multiple times that it was suicide. So that's what was ultimately put out in the media as well. I know her family's still fighting, but at the end of the day, we have to look at the facts. And I believe that this was most likely enough to put her over the edge. So what would you say, Joni, in that, just leading up to like the events leading up to Mica's death and everything that John Paul Miller was doing or allegedly is being accused of doing? Do you think that that was enough to warrant her to potentially make that decision with suffering from mental health issues already?
Well, there's so many different ways to go, with your question. I think your question, Jen, I think there's a couple of things I'd like to say about that. One being that it's always very tricky and difficult when you have somebody in a very difficult situation to look at the mental health issues and try to sort that out. So I clearly have never met Mica. I have never reviewed her mental health records. So I don't know what it means for her to have mental health issues. I do think as mental health professionals, sometimes we overlook or underemphasize the importance of the situation in terms of contributing to mental health issues. Would Mica have had mental health issues, whatever they are, if she had not been in this relationship? I don't know, but I think we need to be very careful in terms of saying, okay, this was something that maybe she did have this pre-existing, condition that she had been diagnosed with earlier, although, she's been in that relationship for a pretty long period of time. But I think it is important, to put that into context, meaning, certainly she was seeing a therapist, which I'm personally very happy that she was, in terms of, I think, therapy can be a very great thing and you get a lot of support with that. But I do think, again, that it's important to look at the context in which somebody has mental health issues. And it does sound like, at least for a while, that Mica was feeling very hopeful about things and was looking forward to the future and those kind of, this feeling like she was getting her life back. And she put out a very empowering video shortly before she died. In terms of the cause of death, it's so interesting because I know that there have been so many people, particularly her family, who has been very outspoken and thinking that there was foul play involved. And it's interesting, Jen, because one of my specialty areas is staged suicide. So deaths that are staged as suicides when they're actually murders. And I've collected a lot of data on that. And taking the mental health issues aside, which I don't know all the mental health issues that Mica experienced, there are so many consistencies in terms of the coercive control, in terms of the fact that they were getting separated, that she had just served divorce papers. There's so many similarities between so many of the staged suicide cases that I have collected and some of the facts here that I can understand why it would be very difficult for people to accept the fact that she committed suicide. I'm not saying that this was a staged suicide. There seems to be a considerable amount of evidence that it was not, that she died by suicide, and that all the evidence that's been presented so far has supported the fact that, for whatever reason at that time, Mica made the decision that her life, that she no longer wanted to live her life right now, at that time. So what would have put her over the edge? I've thought about this so many times, and, this is speculation on my part, but the thing that keeps coming back to me is the amount of harassment that she felt like she was experiencing from JP. The fact that he had posted a picture of her, an inappropriate picture online, that he was continuing to harass her. I wonder if she got to the point where she started believing that there was no way out, that the only way out for her, the only way she could really escape this situation was by taking control of her own life. And in her mind, I think at that moment, it meant exiting this world. It meant leaving this life. And that seems to make the most sense to me in terms of her making that decision.
Yeah, Joni, I would definitely have to agree, just based on, again, you're looking at all the factors of this case and what we have evidence of. We really have to look at is the evidence. What can we prove? It does show, like you said, that all signs are pointing that it was suicide, unfortunately. But it's such an interesting case. It really is, because like you said, just as a professional, there are signs that it could have definitely been a setup. And that's what's so difficult. But at the end of the day, the evidence that was collected, by the detectives and doing their investigation and the autopsy, they couldn't prove that. So we just have to look at, okay, these are the facts. And I would have to agree. I think that, if you look at everything that has happened, if you look at the timeline, if you look at the reports, the police reports that Mica had filed, yes, she was feeling very hopeful. And there's evidence of that too on her social media profiles. She was very hopeful. She was moving on to a new church and a new congregation. And that was wonderful. And it's just so sad that she really was trying to move on with her life. And 2 days after she officially filed for divorce from John Paul Miller is when she chose to end her life. But I think you're right. I think if I had to, give my opinion, obviously these are just opinions.
Yes.
If I had to give my opinion on what actually happened or what we could say pushed Mica over the edge. Again, I'm not a medical professional or anything, but just in my opinion, looking at the facts of the case, is that he obviously played a role in her decision. I do believe that. I do believe his actions and things that he did most likely resulted in that, because you're right. I believe that she felt she had no way out. No matter what she did, no matter how much she tried to move on, he wasn't allowing that to happen. And again, that's just based on what we're seeing. And this is alleged. Again, we have to say alleged, because even in the police reports, we want to believe it is John Paul Miller that was involved in all of this, but the name is redacted from those reports. So we can't confirm nor deny that, but we can all come to our own conclusion. And I would say the same. I would have to agree.
It is such an unfortunate situation, because I think that if Mica had been able to hold on, had been able to find a way to see past the immediate circumstance, which I think is hard to do. It is very, very difficult to do. I did a show one time looking at or interviewing people who had attempted to die by suicide and failed, just to kind of see what their life had been like since then. And 100%, there were people who were talking about the fact that I'm so happy that I failed. In parentheses, failed. My life has been so, they were talking about all the things they would have missed out on. And yet they were able to talk about the hopelessness they felt at that particular point in time. And that's one of the hardest things I think about depression and about despair, is that it's almost like, we've all had the flu and you feel so bad. And it's like we forget that we don't always have the flu. We forget that I felt better 2 weeks ago. I'm going to feel better again. It feels like I've always had the flu. And I think sometimes depression and despair and despondency feels that way. Like I can't remember what it felt like not to feel this way. And even worse, I can't envision myself feeling differently in the future.
Yeah, it's so sad. It really is. And I think that's so interesting that you got the opportunity to interview people that, like you said, have quote unquote failed, and how they felt failing and still being able to move on and live their lives. And it's unfortunate, because you're right. Some people are so overwhelmed in their life at that moment, just based on circumstances, and they believe that that's the best option. I truly believe that they do it with the best intentions. They think that that's ultimately what's the best thing for them at that time. And it's just so sad and so unfortunate. And in the case of Mica Miller, what makes it even more devastating is that she really genuinely was trying to move on with her life, and she was getting there. But when you have someone who is manipulative and who is ultimately trying to cause strife in your life, and they already know that you're struggling or that you're having a hard time, whether you have mental health issues or not, we can even look at it just from a generalized point of view. Somebody who's going through a rough time and going through a divorce and, didn't have a very good marriage, that person alone is going to struggle. You're going to struggle. Mm-hmm. But then add someone who is, like you said, we can't diagnose. We don't know exactly what Mica had, but we do know, we can confirm that she was struggling with some type of mental health issues, and play that into, everything else that was going on. And this is ultimately where we're at. And now we're sitting on a podcast talking about her case. And the one thing that I hope that our listeners get out of this is that covering true crime cases is difficult because you see all different types of cases and you see how it affects these victims, right? And sometimes it's hard to accept the fact that some of these victims do end their lives. And sometimes it is foul play, and sometimes that's not seen and it's not found. And it's really hard for the families. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the families who are still having to move on and still suffering from that tragic loss. And I think that they get lost in the mix of things. The victim's voice gets lost in the mix of things because then everyone's looking at the media frenzy. And that's what ultimately I try to do when I'm covering cases is really be mindful, be respectful, ethically report these stories. But I think it's also important to dive into the root of the issue, like the actual root cause and root issue here. And we're looking at toxic relationships. We're looking at, in this case, females or women who are in these abusive relationships and don't know how to get out. And sometimes they end very tragically like this. Either they're killed or they end their own lives because they feel like they have no way out.
And I think also it's so difficult when you have this kind of potential stalking going on and potential harassment or alleged harassment going on. I think that adds another layer. But I think the other part of it as a psychologist is just to think about all these years of conditioning that Mica may have had and all these internal messages that she's developed, right, about what it means to be a good wife, what it means to be a good Christian, what it means to be in this relationship, and having to unravel that and undo that. And that is a Herculean task in some respects. And so I think that it's just like, many people will talk about when they leave a cult. People kind of go, oh, I felt, nobody that I've ever spoken to has ever said, I just immediately felt so happy, because it's like their whole world is turned upside down. It's hard to make that transition. Is it better? 1,000,000%. There's an opportunity for a different life, for to make your own choice, to have freedom, to heal, to do all these things, to not be under somebody else's control. And yet, invariably, you'll hear that it was like the struggle within was so difficult. After leaving this part of it, I had to deal with this part of it in here, and that can just be so hard. And there's also that transition period. I think certainly there would have been for Mica in terms of this process of leaving, which is still ongoing, and now having to deal with all the internal stuff. And it's hard to imagine that no matter how clear she was about leaving, that there weren't still messages to her about guilt, or I'm doing the wrong thing, or this is not what I was taught as a Christian woman, or all those things. Even if she knows that that's not the right thing for her, that's not the right thing for anybody, how we feel about it can be very, very different from what we know.
That's a really good point. And one thing I want to point out too is that those that don't or haven't experienced any type of abuse or manipulation or have been in a toxic relationship, one of the biggest stigmas that I'm seeing is women being judged for either leaving the situation and then going back, or, like you said, leaving and still struggling internally and maybe even what we can call relapsing in a relationship, where they may go back and then they may leave again. So can you give us a little insight just on your professional experience, why a woman might go back, even if she's in that state, like, okay, I know this is not good for me. I know what I'm experiencing is not good for me, but they may go back. And I just want to make that a little bit clearer, because some people don't understand. They're like, well, why would she go back? Why would Mica stay as long as she did? Why wouldn't she have left that relationship sooner? I think it would be really important to touch on that.
So a couple of things. So if you look at domestic violence in general, we know that nobody ever gets involved in a domestic violence relationship. They get involved in a good relationship that becomes violent, it becomes abusive. So oftentimes there's this period of time when it's a really great relationship. And so people want to hang on to that. And even when it's bad, oftentimes there's that cycle we hear about all the time of somebody, getting hurt. And then the person's, I'm so sorry, it'll never happen again. And here's some flowers and here's some gifts. And I love you so much. And it's me. I'm a weak person, whatever that whole thing comes. And the person wants to believe that. They love this person. And they want to believe that this is the real person. The real person is the person who I love, the person who's good to me at times, the person who cares about me, who's thoughtful, who brings me gifts, who not this person over here. who loses control or who has an anger problem or whatever. So there's that part of it, I think, that it's rarely bad all the time. So there's that part of it in general, the dynamics, and, you can read about over and over again in a million different books. And yet, if you haven't lived them, I think it's impossible to really, really understand that. And then when you add this spiritual component to it and you add these religious teachings about respecting your husband and doing what this person says, and this is your responsibility as a wife, and to build up your husband. And, there's all these messages about what this means from a spiritual standpoint. That adds a whole nother layer. So now you're talking about getting out of a relationship that you've been in for a long time. You've been really in a relationship in terms of knowing this person for 14, since you were 14 years old. And you at one point seemed to worship this person as a pastor and as somebody that you really looked up to. And you've had all these messages about how wonderful this person is and how you should be as a wife and how you should be as a Christian and all these things, in addition to the kind of regular dynamics that we often see in interpersonal violence. And it just becomes so difficult. And it would be unusual, I think, not to have mixed feelings, not to go back a couple of times. And we know that people do, because there are those bonds.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Joni. And as far as kind of the cycle of that too, like where you said a lot of times, even when the manipulator or the person in the relationship that's doing the abusing will come back and will apologize and will what they call love bomb, give tons of gifts and do all these things and promise it'll never happen again. And then they continuously go in this cycle. It happens over and over again until it gets worse. But you're right with the spiritual and the religious factor, especially in Mica's case, because she was a Christian woman and she was so deep into her church, and that was very important to her, was her faith. It adds an extra layer, which I'm sure made it even more difficult. And then what we can do too is kind of move on in a minute. I want to talk a little bit about John Paul Miller's reactions and things that he had said after Mica's death, even to his congregation as a pastor, which I think is just horrendous. But I can only imagine, the things that he's saying as a pastor and making her look like this terrible person to the entire church congregation.
The other thing I just wanted to add before we move on is I think it's very, very important. And that is a very practical reality that anybody who's in a violent relationship, certainly in a physically violent relationship, I'm talking about interpersonal violence between two people. There's also a practical reason people go back, and that's because they're afraid of what's going to happen if they do leave. So I don't want to, as a psychologist, of course, I'm going to focus on those psychological reasons that we stay or that we leave or whatever, but there are very practical reasons why people do stay, because we know that the person is most in danger when they're leaving a relationship. So sometimes people will get out, they're threatened, I'm going to kill you if you don't come back, I'm going to hurt your pet, I'm going to hurt your kids or whatever. And so they come back for that reason. So I think it's really important for me not to overlook that part of it as well.
And I'm really glad that you mentioned that too. I mean, even if we look at the Mica Miller case, there again, allegedly, but there have been claims that John Paul Miller did threaten Mica and that she was fearful for her life. Again, there's documentation that that's what Mica had said. And again, these are alleged claims, but it wouldn't be surprising. And that could be another reason why it did take her as long as it did to leave, because she didn't feel safe to do so. So I'm really glad that you did point that out, because I think that is something that isn't talked about enough either, is that they're fearful and they're afraid that either, like you said, their pet, their children, their family, someone's going to get hurt, or themselves if they were to move on from their relationship. It's terrible. It's devastating, but it's terrifying to be in that. I mean, I couldn't even imagine being in that situation. So
it would be, it is so terrifying, I think. Having talked to victims of domestic violence, and just this reality that there's no way to completely protect yourself. It's so difficult to, and live a normal life for sure. So, we all talk about leaving and there are safety plans, and there are certainly ways to greatly reduce your risk. But it's, I think anybody will tell you that, there's no way to be 100% safe. And so I think that there's a real world consideration here that I'm glad we are talking about.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, because you see a lot of these cases too, where the individual will take all the proper steps. They'll go to the authorities, they'll get a restraining order, they'll do these things. And, it's not in all cases, obviously. It's still important to put those things in place, but it doesn't always work. That's in their head. And that, what if I can't get out? So it's another thing to consider when you do see a victim of domestic violence end their lives, because they're in a situation where, like you mentioned before, they really genuinely do not feel like they have any escape or any way out.
Yeah.
And it's so tragic.
It is.
But moving on, one thing that I really want to kind of dissect is John Paul Miller's behavior. And obviously this is just dissecting. We're only giving, our opinions. And Joni, I know you'll be giving your professional opinion. I think his behavior was so odd after Mica's passing. And I think this is another reason why the spotlight came on him, and another reason why many people do believe that he had something to do with her suicide and that it could have been staged. But it's because of his behavior and the way that he talked about Mica after her death to his entire church congregation. I did watch it, and it was horrendous. Like, I was so taken back. Like, my goodness, you are supposed to be technically her husband because they weren't divorced yet. It was just the way that he was talking about her. And then even the obituary that he wrote for Mica was mainly talking about himself and how he was such a great husband and a great pastor. It's not an obituary that you would write for your loved one. And that's something that I pointed out when I covered Mica's case too in the first episode, because it was just appalling. So what's your take on that, Joni? Like, as a professional, seeing those type of behaviors, what strikes you in that scenario? I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean he's guilty of doing anything, but it's just strange.
Well, certainly the fact that he announced his wife's death at the end of a sermon was kind of mind-blowing, I think. I mean, it's hard to imagine a scenario where that would make sense. I mean, in terms of if you cared about somebody, that you would literally get up in front of your congregation. She is also a member of your congregation. She has been deeply involved in the church, in so many, wearing so many different hats. And people love her, right? So it's not that even that this is somebody that the congregation wouldn't know. I can't think of any logical reason why you would not handle that very differently. So I thought that was incredibly odd. I thought the fact that he immediately talked about it being self-inflicted was something that was also unusual, from a practical matter. When you hear about all these allegations, if they're true, of infidelity, of him having a girlfriend and those kinds of things. I mean, there are all these behaviors in addition to how he's, behaved after the fact that certainly do, raise questions about how much he did really love his wife, because that's not what we expect in a relationship where two people are committed to each other. If you have problems, if you have issues, then you go get help and you go together and you work things out, or you work things out individually. You don't use those whatever addictions or behavior problems or whatever as a reason to do things outside of your marriage, particularly if you're a minister. So I don't even have to look at some of the behaviors in terms of the odd kind of strange things that he said to look at just things that he did, as much as he's not wanting to get divorced or talking about, threatening her if she leaves allegedly or those kinds of things. It's like, where is the evidence that he really cared about her? That's what I want to see. Where is the evidence that he cared about her or he loved her as his wife?
I think that's a really great point. And I think that's something that maybe, again, with your experience, looking at behaviors of abusers or what we can say narcissists or whatever, when you're looking at these types of dynamics, these relationships, I mean, he claims that he hasn't done anything that is being alleged, but your behavior is saying something different. And that's what I got out of it too, is, did you really love your wife? I mean, why were you married then? It's very obvious the dynamic of the relationship. And it's very obvious that what she's claiming is most likely true. Again, just in my opinion, but it is very odd. His behavior is very odd, just everything that he did. And you're right, announcing it like during a sermon, very inappropriate. I've never seen a pastor do that. I've never heard of that happening before, but it does also make him look guilty. And I can see why people are questioning his involvement. How much was he involved in Mica's death? So it's not that shocking.
I also think that, the fact that he apparently, and this is again public information, so if it's accurate, then great. If it's not, then I'm basing some of my statements on that. But the fact that he allegedly went over to their house, to retrieve these diaries or these writings of Mica's and was very invested in retrieving those. And then her family has talked about in terms of what has been in those diaries, I think has really done a lot of corroboration of what other people had observed or had seen. It's horrific. the things that were apparently in this diary that Mica was journaling about and writing about. And I think that's also been another reason why, so many people have been reluctant to let this go, this idea that somehow JP had hurt Mica in some way, because there, just all these things that kind of came out was just story after story in these writings of different ways that Mica did feel mistreated by JP.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it also, again, shines a spotlight on JP. And again, if this is just speculation, if all of these things are true that Mica was claiming and the whole grooming aspect, who's to say Mica was his only victim? There may have been others that may come out in the future, but I've seen that a lot too in past cases when there's a dynamic like this, where there's abuse or there's grooming involved. There's usually not just one victim. It's happened to others. You're right. I think that that's a huge thing with the diaries, because that proves and it corroborates everything that her family is saying. I think everyone believes what has been stated by Mica. What reason would she have to, lie or make up stories? But one thing I do want to point out is just recently, I've seen in the media, in some news outlets, that JP has stated that he has all of this evidence that's going to corroborate his side of the story, and that he does have the diaries, and that it's going to blow people's minds. And I just don't believe it. I think that it's his way of trying to salvage his reputation, which I think is at this point already destroyed, in my opinion. But who's to say there aren't more victims out there, or that something in that diary will open another can of worms of what he did, or kind of expose him even more so than he already has been.
Well, I believe, and I know you've done a deep dive on this case already, Jen, so you can jump in here as well. I believe that his previous wife had made some statements about when they separated and were getting a divorce, in terms of at least some harassing behavior and some stalking behavior. So there's certainly some other allegations that he engaged in some similar kind of behaviors when they were getting a divorce. Now, I don't know in terms of their marriage, what all she was alleging that might have happened within their marriage, but certainly when she was leaving the marriage, it sounded like some pretty scary things happened to her.
And you're absolutely right. Yes, there are allegations with his first wife. And I know it's minimal, and I'm sure that's just to protect herself and her privacy as well. That's like my whole point, is there's usually not just one victim. That perpetrator has most likely done this before, done this with someone else. And unfortunately, in this case with Mica, it ended so tragically for her. Luckily, the first wife got out of the relationship and is okay. But, it's such a tragic story. And I know that her family right now is working on getting a law passed about domestic violence. I know they're working really hard, and they're doing a lot of things behind the scenes to honor Mica and her story. And so I really hope that there's something good that comes out of Mica's tragedy. When you look at her story, there's so many women that have similar stories, and some of them make it through and some of them don't. And I think it's just so important to continue to spread awareness about domestic violence and how, like, the tragedies that can come out of it when either you don't have the support, or you have someone like JP Miller who has a lot of authority or has a lot of power over that individual, and they ultimately don't feel like they have any way out. And obviously, Mica's family has been very supportive, at least what they say, and they claim they've been really supportive, and they knew a lot of these claims. But at the end of the day, it wasn't enough to help Mica and to save her.
And I think is such a tragedy, because I think most of us may have known somebody who's been in a relationship that we just looked at that relationship and thought, this is so not good for you. This is so unhealthy for you. And yet we don't know what to do. And I think, that's one of the hardest things to kind of accept, is that we can't make somebody, get out of a relationship as much as we might want to, or, shake them until they get some sense in their head, or all the thoughts that we have, we're feeling that urgency for them, that concern for them. But we can all do something in terms of just listening or being a part of their lives. And, one of the things I tell people all the time, if you are in a relationship that's unhealthy for you and you cannot get out for whatever reason right now, just do not ever let yourself be isolated. There are people out there, whether it's on the internet, whether it's in your church, whether it's with a friend, whether it's at work, there is always somebody outside of your immediate circle even that, you can talk to, that you can get some support from. And that's so important, because I think when that contact or that other worldview, that other perspective is not there, it becomes so much harder to see clearly. You're seeing one view. You're in a relationship with somebody who's just providing that and making sure that you're only getting that one view. So it's so important, I think, to, if you know somebody, to be supportive and just, say, I'm concerned about you. What can I do? And if you're in that relationship, to make sure that you are getting some support.
That's really good feedback, Joni. Thank you for that. And I think to your point about being isolated, I think that's when things get very, very dangerous. And I think that's what happened in Mica's case, is that she was getting isolated, and John Paul and his actions and things he was doing, he knew what he was doing. And that, I think, ultimately was the goal, was to isolate Mica. So she felt that way. Do we know whether or not that was his goal, was for her to end her life? We don't know that. It could have just been he wanted control over the relationship. He wanted to control her, and it just ended the way that it did. But at the end of the day, it's still tragic. And like you said, there's always some type of support. And I will make sure that I leave any resources that I come across that I know, if you're currently struggling, if you're in a relationship and you feel stuck or you feel isolated, please use these resources. There's help available. And even if you don't have a family support or friend support, there's options, there's hotlines and support out there for you. So I will make sure I'll leave all of that information in the show notes below. This has been amazing. This has been an incredible conversation. I really, really enjoyed chatting with you, Joni, and getting your feedback and talking about this case. Obviously, love to invite you back to talk about more cases, because this is just so important. It's important to kind of deep dive into these cases and to dissect certain areas, especially like this, when you're dealing with spousal abuse or any type of abuse, or that women and even men, I mean, everyone goes through some type of abuse. They can go through some type of abuse. It's not just men, women, it could be children. But I want to continue to spread that awareness so people know that they're not alone. And if that is somebody out there right now that's struggling, that they know that they have options and they have resources to turn to, and that they don't need to end their lives. Because I know that that's, again, in Mica's case, that's ultimately what she chose to do. And my goodness, it's just so sad. It's so sad. But you think of all the what ifs, what if. But now all we can do is look at Mica's story and share and bring more awareness to it.
And I think use the story, which you are, Jen, which I so much appreciate, using the story and her story to help other people, which I know that she would have wanted. I mean, that's one of the last things that she did. And a couple of weeks before she died was that video, which I'm sure you've seen, which was just, it was so empowering to me for her to be talking about that, because she's talking about it in a spiritual context. And I thought that was very, very powerful, that she's finding a way to say, no, you can be spiritual. You can keep your Christian faith, and realize that the number one thing about that is that if you're a bride of Christ, that he's not going to want you to be in a situation like this. This is the number one thing that you can do. And I think that's so important, because that was such a powerful part of her life, an important part of, and it is for so many people, and so finding a way to be in for faith or spirituality, or however people think of that, and be able to be in that space and yet feel like it is never going to be a bad thing or a negative thing or a hurtful thing or a painful thing or a limiting thing, is so important.
And I agree. I think it is very empowering, because at the end of the day, she realized that, she knew that.
Yeah.
And I believe that, she understood that it was being used against her, and that's not how it should be.
Yeah.
And I do agree. I think that's very empowering. Again, it's sad. It's a tragedy. But at the end of the day, I think Mica was a very, very strong woman. And I think that, she went through a lot, but was at least able to recognize what was actually happening. And so,
yes, I do too.
Yeah, I think that's an important piece, and a really important key takeaway, I think, at the end of the day.
I think it is too, because I think what it shows is that you can have somebody who has been potentially groomed for more than half of her life, and yet she had the strength and the courage to really examine that and re-examine that and realize that she was strong, and that it wasn't a relationship that was supportive of her, and it wasn't a relationship that anybody needed to be in. And I think that's such a powerful message.
If you're struggling today, just know that you are wanted, you are needed, and you are loved. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. I'll catch you in the next one.